Hi, I'm Rich and welcome to episode 3 of the Hytro Performance Podcast. Today we're speaking to John Noonan, who's a performance consultant at Hytro Racing. He's also the S&C coach of F1 driver Yuki Tsunoda, and we're going to speak to John about his philosophy on coaching, how he's introduced BFR, and how he's preparing ahead of the Japan Grand Prix. John, great to have you here. For those that are unfamiliar, can you just introduce yourself and describe what you do in the world of motorsport?
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for having me on first and foremost. Excited to have a little chat with you guys. And my role right now is a performance coach. And I guess by the very nature of that title, it's quite holistic. I'm concerned with everything from the physical, the recovery, the nutritional, to the mental support that we can provide, a wraparound service that enables, these high performers, particularly Formula One drivers, to perform at their best in their space. So we're there to enable that.
So it'd be interesting to hear a bit about your philosophy on coaching, because you have had such varied roles. At what point does what you do become sport specific versus just you now have just this incredibly wide base of great foundational knowledge as well?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question. And I'm really aware of that. I think when you first come to a conversation with a new sport and new people within a new sport, naturally people can be quite curious about your ability to bed well into a new environment or offer something of, say, value in a new environment if you haven't worked there before. I certainly felt that going into football. Have you played football? Have you worked in football before? People like specific people because they're going to fit easily. And generally speaking, I think if you zoom out of the sport specificness and think about what are the key factors that I'm assessed on here, and it's actually, can you relate to people and can you understand the problems that they're dealing with, and do you have solutions to those problems? So invariably it becomes a people thing. It's a people business ultimately. And I joked with a few peers across the time, but if you're working in a sport or even in team sports essentially, and you go from one team to another, it's essentially different tracksuit, different accents, but same problems or same requirements.
Yeah.
So you end up developing this foundational breadth of skills, attributes, and key responsibilities that you fit into, and you essentially get really good at recognizing what ecologically people need from you in that space. And you kind of, like a chameleon, can duck and weave and slip into those areas. So that's where people then open the door and go, oh, okay, you do get it, you do understand it, and ultimately the sport specificness follows.
Yeah.
We can get into the nuance of that, but yeah, it's kind of going broad first and just having some really curious and honest conversations about what you can offer, what people need, and how you can support those challenges or needs.
Is there like a John Noonan brand of coaching or approach to preparing and to training and recovering athletes?
I wouldn't call it a John Noonan brand. I think that if you were to coin it anything, it would be a generalist specialist, which is a term that most people are familiar with. And you get very good generally at having a knowledge and a skill set within a range of areas, from physical athletic preparation to recognizing how you maximize and optimize someone's athletic recovery, their well-being, their wellness, how then you integrate with the other disciplines of performance science, with physiotherapy, physical therapies, to the doctors, to the nutritionists. And you get very good, I think, at having some integrated conversations about what does best practice look like, or what does optimal look like, and within where we are on that pathway, how far or how close are we playing to that ideal right now? And if we're not there, what strategies or processes do we put in place to get there?
Yeah.
And if we are there, fantastic. How do we look about sustaining success and or leveling up into the future? So it's very kind of broad brush, I think, approach initially, coming in and asking lots of questions, being very, very aware of not trying to overstep the mark and lead with too much ego, and just listening before you start to advise and recommend and suggest. And then once you've kind of got, I think, a really strong understanding about what people need from you or what the sport needs from you, then you can lead with experience and insight. So yeah, generally specialist, I think, was probably the one.
It was funny because we obviously get to work across so many sports at Hytro, and we're really fortunate to have such a vast coaching community. It really is the coaches like yourself that I would know if it's fair to say, is almost like human first approach to coaching. That's the one that other coaches then refer to or hold up as best practice. And I'm going to ask you a question now, which feels like an end of the interview question, and we're going to get real deep on some topics. But just touching on that, that adaptability, is that something you wish maybe you had that advice earlier on? Like, it's not, you don't necessarily need to know everything. You've just got to be adaptable to the athlete. Would that be fair suggestion?
Yeah, look, I think that is fair, and I think if you are an ambitious coach in any right, and you're looking to affect practice, have impact, and help people improve and develop, or be successful, you are, I think, pretty hungry the way that you apply certain ideas or interventions or training programs. You get quite aggressive quite quick, and through that process, I think you ultimately learn because of the mistakes that you're making with, I've not really read the script properly here, or I haven't seen the need to just hit pause and really think about critically, am I actually providing the right solution here? Is this right? Despite the fact that I've seen what's the saying? If everything you have is if all you have is a hammer, everything you see is a net. Like, you're just looking to ram your solutions into every single pocket that you can. I think without truly recognizing the nuance and all that people need from you. And look, I think the adage is very true. People don't care what you know until they know that you care. That human first comment that you had before, you think it's bang on. And I can refer to a few times, a few stories of I had so much more impact with my athletes when I took a moment out to go, let's not talk performance for a second. Let's just talk on a human level without sort of, making it too sticky as a conversation, but to go, are you all right? Is everything all right? Is there anything I can do? Or somebody who just walks in, just had a new baby, and they're maybe a senior player in a squad and going, mate, don't worry. We're going to trim this up for you today, make a few changes in your programming. I'm going to give you an easier day. Let's just get you through the day and let's look after you. And here's what we can do nutritionally. Here's what we can do from a prep point of view. And, I think it just being normal, I think it goes a long way to people seeing that you treat them as a person and not just a data point. I think that can get lost quite quickly. I certainly got, maybe into the weeds of that sometimes earlier in my career, and it only through, I think, errors and hindsight do you think differently.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for just be normal, just just be approachable, just talk to people. So we've been really lucky that you've kind of adopted BFR with a lot of the athletes that you work with, having had previous experience with it. I think now, obviously, you've seen early stages of Hytro, and you've helped us develop to what we're doing now in a scale that we've been able to reach. Could you just talk to me a little bit about your initial uses of BFR in your career, and then perhaps how you are using it now in a motorsport environment with that type of athlete?
Yeah, for sure. And look, and I think what Hytro have done, and I know this isn't necessarily podcast selling the idea of Hytro, and I'm not about to jump on that bandwagon, but what they've done is taken something of a method that's got huge amounts of research behind it, decades of research and validity, to say that it is a worthwhile intervention. And if you have a need or a problem that you're trying to solve, be that physical preparation or physical recovery, that BFR is a worthwhile solution. I think, look, we're very much in a day and age now where most people, if we're honest, want high return for little investment. They want quick results without really suffering the effort to get there. And BFR, especially within Hytro now, have allowed me in my setting, particularly with I'm now part of a traveling circus, and have been to some fashion for the last 5 years in some of the junior categories, but you haven't got a perfect training environment or laboratory where you can click into some of the more kind of gold standard considered BFR options out there, and you need something that's might be a little bit, quick and light touch, but it's easy to apply on the move. And so I think, my first experience actually zoning out would be in rugby, and I smile working with a few academy players on a Friday afternoon. And on one angle, you look at them for doing some bicep reps and just trying to get a pump before they go out on a Friday night with their mates around, or on a pub, whatever it might be, or with the student nights. But these were lads just sort of fashioning their own straps, if you like, tourniquets on their arms, and just going until you saw their arm turn purple. And you're turning a bit of a blind eye at the time. You're like, I'm not really sure what that is,
Yeah.
but I kind of get what you're trying to achieve there. Um, and initially it was kind of, all right, socially, there's something happening there. They're enjoying it, and they are they are experimenting with age-old understood practices. And then the research started to obviously offer a little bit more credence to the fact that actually, if you are going to do that, you do get huge amounts of hypertrophy, you do get strength gain, you do improve tissue mitochondria. Like there's a host of benefits from doing it. And then now in my setting, I think it's fair to say that if we're looking at what are the primary needs for F1 drivers from a physical athletic preparation point of view, first thing we recognize is that there is a weight restriction on these drivers. So we're not looking to impose, unless there's a specific case, but we're not really interested in chasing huge amounts of tissue hypertrophy because of the weight limits in the car. We can't make these guys too heavy, nor is that necessarily productive muscle mass to some extent. If they're really underdeveloped, then yeah, that can accelerate that pathway of physical training. But if you've got someone with a reasonable amount of training experience, like the guy that I work with now, you probably aren't going to throw it in too often for things like hypertrophy. Maybe for strength development, if you've got probably a bit of a challenge within your training program because the schedule is quite congested, you're not getting as much training exposure as you like. Maybe you'd like to accelerate the adaptations that you can get from doing a minimum amount of training here and there. And BFR certainly is a really reasonable solution to use in that setting there, where you want huge return for a little bit amount of stress and time. From a recovery point of view, we're certainly on vogue with that regularly. I think the research around tissue recovery, nervous system recovery, improving things like heart rate variability is really well accepted. So why wouldn't we throw it on after these guys have been in the car or strap in for a few minutes in the hotel room when they get back for a late evening without the need to go through, extensive recovery protocols. So it's quick, it's easy. There's no wires, no faff in that sense from a Hytro point of view. So we'll throw it on in the hotel room, or when we're traveling for long periods of time, we'll get it on, and maybe after events. And anecdotally, they report subjectively feeling fresher, lighter, more rested. And that's, even if we're playing with a placebo angle, that's good enough for me. So yeah, largely at the moment it's from a training point of view, but we'll choose our exposures with that, and then more frequently in the recovery space.
Yeah, so funny you referred to the race circuit as traveling circus because it really is up and go from city to city. I guess in F1 resources are reasonably good, so you're not going to end up in like Holiday Inn with just a 2 kilo dumbbell. But you don't know necessarily always what facilities you're going into, the time you're going to be landing. And we know that there's a large amount of mental toughness in drivers. I think that's well documented. What's probably still difficult for some people to grasp is in a sport like motorsport, what's the car and what's the athlete? How do you describe the athlete as a motorsport driver? Like what they're akin to? They're not built like a rugby player. They're lean like cyclists, but they don't have that big power need for output. Like what makes a motorsport athlete?
They have attributes that, as you say, are akin to other sports from a performance point of view. Some people might look at them as a bit more of a cerebral athlete, let's say, and they have to deliver under those intense moments. They have to make huge decisions under massive pressure, and they're trying to attack and defend their position on the track 24/7. And largely that's based on their action perception of what they can see and how effective they are at linking their skill set of maneuvering a car and optimizing the balance on the tire to get a performance outcome. So you could look at that, but then underneath all of that, they've got a really good engine. And these guys are as fit as really fit endurance cyclists. They've got VO2 maxes more often in excess of 60, and they're very, very healthy individuals. If I work really hard on improving someone's maximal fitness who's already fit, is that going to yield an improvement in podium positions or make them 5 or 10% better on the track? Probably not. So from a selfishly from a physical prep point of view, I want to make them fit enough so that it doesn't become the limiting factor in their technical performance. But certainly, if we're thinking about what is the defining USP with getting those improvements on track, I'm going mental, largely aligned with their skill, you know,
Yeah.
their talent and where skill's concerned as well. But if we're talking Formula One, 99% of the individuals who sit in that grid are in those, top 20 guys in those cars. They are exceptional. They are the top of the top. They are the elite of their domain. So more often than not, you then start to play a role of being a bit of a enabler where it comes from a mental point of view, sometimes challenging them with difficult conversations and questions, other times support them heavily from a psychological point of view because of the stress and the turmoil that they're under, the media intrusion that they get, and other times you're a friend. And you try to have to wear different hats in that space so that you can, if you will, in certain areas, unburden them from a mental point of view, but also help them become really intelligent, astute, emotionally astute individuals who can manage themselves effectively under huge amounts of pressure. And that's not easy to do. A lot of them are good performers, but very few have that mental capacity to deal with the adversity, the decision making, and the wins and the losses.
Yeah. So you certainly have to wear a hat for a wide range of responsibilities. And it's interesting, we hear, again, coaches from different sports saying, I know nothing's more important than recovery. In your pre-season, there's loads of different ways of creating adaptations to create either more volume or greater output. But probably for you in the season like we are now, it seems stupid point, but like recovery must be the single most important part of that performance coaching that you're doing. Just being able, because you're not going to necessarily create any new adaptation or want to, right? You're not trying to pack weight on. There's not necessarily a further level of endurance. You just want to keep them healthy, injury-free, mentally, physically recover so they can go 110% the following week. Is that right?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, there's in an F1 season, there's 24 races and there's 24 opportunities for them to score points, to demonstrate that they are someone of value to a team because it's incredibly competitive. Certainly in the last few years, we've seen the amount of drivers that have lost their seat, lost their position because they've underperformed. And if they're not performing, teams now, because of the demand, because of the breadth of talent that's available, they're not always that patient. And some teams do it differently to others, but they have to perform. And if you're looking at under recovery as one of those potential factors that is a knock-on impact with how fresh somebody is or how rested somebody is to deal with the rigors of a really tough race week in a tough environment, then why wouldn't we be looking at that? Why wouldn't we be taking care of that particular element? So it's really high on our agenda. You've made the right points. Physically, athletically, we've got to be good enough. And if we can be exceptional, great. But I don't want that to be at the cost either of chasing that too much and that being a knock-on impact with creating some cumulative fatigue that's rolling into a race week when actually we want to freshen them up where we can because it's a congested calendar. I mean, we've just done the UAE rounds. So we did Bahrain, Jeddah. There was a week in between then traveling to Australia. So there's a lot, there's a lot of air miles clocked up already. And then in between that, my guy in particular came back to after Jeddah, came back to Milton Keynes, was in the sim for a couple of days, had a couple of commercial engagements, and then he flew back home before quickly jetting off again into Australia. So they're not sitting around in spas, on these week offs. They're very busy people and have got a lot of personal business demands and needs as that's flying around as well. So yeah, holistically, there's a lot going on for them.
So we've seen loads of Yuki on the recent Drive to Survive series, which I think has done an amazing job of bringing people into the sport globally who weren't necessarily purists before. They love the action, and we're seeing the other side of these guys as athletes and as personal brands. One of the things that I remember from recent episodes is Yuki says he hates training. So I'm sure it's nothing to do with you, but can you give us a little bit of insight on how you've actually found working with him and what you've done to make him hopefully fall in love with it?
The statement is accurate. It's absolutely bang on. He, tongue in cheek, he was honest with me. we were talking about, the importance of building teamship between us and being really honest with each other, being transparent about things. He was like, oh, okay, on the topic of that, I hate training. Oh, this is really good because I love it. So, you know, that was a barrier to cross. Nonetheless, he recognizes that it's really important for him to be physically and mentally where he needs to be. He's the first person to tell me if he's feeling his neck a little bit too much in the car because he feels underprepared. So they recognize the need for it, whether or not they're in love with it or not. Some others, I think, enjoy it a bit more. And I try and start from a place of, well, what do you enjoy? And let's start there. And then I'll slip in some of the less inviting stuff. It's a bit like hide the broccoli. It's we get the fun stuff done first so we can start on a really happy mode. And then I'll slip in the stuff that's a little bit more mundane, but that he still recognizes he needs to do. So we're in Dubai earlier this year in pre-season training camp for 2 weeks. And conditioning, not so much of a problem. He'd rip in. Weight training, a bit less exciting, and I can understand that. So we'd start with a competitive game, and we like a bit like a squash, play wall ball. Initially, I was kicking his ass, and then he started to kick my ass, which was a bit embarrassing. So we just start with a fun competitive game, and then we'd lead into the rest of the session from there. So, but yeah, to be fair to him, he trains hard, and I've strength trained for years, and I'm 30 kilos on top of him. So he was then trying to push some of my weights that I was lifting, which I was quite surprised by, if not a bit concerned with at the start as well. But true to form, he's a very competitive man, and for sure, as long as there's some competition in training, he's into it.
That's amazing. I'm sure, yeah, I mean, it should be a given, right, that they're hyper competitive given the sport they're in and the fine margins that we're talking about.
Right, exactly.
So have you introduced BFR into anything that you've been doing with Yuki, or is that something still in the back pocket to roll out later?
Exactly. I think what I've learned over time is that despite motivation and ambitions, throwing the kitchen sink at somebody initially, what feels like I'm trying to be optimal, on one hand is okay, but on the other hand, it's a little bit naive because you just overwhelm your individual, not least underwhelm the quality of support that you can offer over time. So I looked at, right, what's one of the biggest challenges that we have right now, and it's managing, as mentioned before, extensive air travel, training to competition back into the training environment. What can I do from a recovery point of view to augment that space? So BFR's with Hytro's taken a place for us there straight away. Largely, you're curious at the start of it to see how open somebody is to the sensation, especially if you haven't done it before. I think the sensation that you experience with BFR is quite unique. But he actually quite enjoyed it, and he's asked to do it a few times. So yeah, we've got the Hytro top and shorts, and we'll do that. So after some extensive training periods, or as I say, after we've been in the car. So we're doing that quite regularly now.
At the time of recording this, we're leading up to the Japan Grand Prix. What is there extra pressure for you guys as a team going into that, or are you looking at it like just another race? And how do you prepare your man that physically, mentally, emotionally?
That is a great question. And in the junior racing categories, you already hear the noise around it. It's a thing, drivers go, it's my home race this weekend. Everybody wants to win on the home race. They want to give a good showing to the home race because of, not least of their fans and their core base. So naturally, I think he probably does want to do pretty well. And, fortunately for us, he's flying at the moment. We had a really good showing in terms of results and points scored in Australia. And for me, in some instances, it is business as usual. But in others, I think it's a fallacy if as a coach, you don't recognize the additional added pressure that's around that. So, I think for us, we'll have a conversation or two about that to make sure that it isn't too much of a surprise and a shock when we are there. I'm curious to see what the fans are going to be like. I've heard that they're incredibly excited, shall we just say, and they get quite touchy-feely. So I think we'll be doing a few shuttle sprints in between, trying to dodge a few people and get out of the way of stuff. But I think for us, the main part is just making sure that when all that excitement of arriving comes, that we can very quickly click into the space that we need to be mentally, and just then get down to business and usual process.
Yeah, it's funny because like every race is obviously very different, and different demands on both the machine and the athlete. Are there any that you already have earmarked as like we are going to have to do something specific to prepare or to recover or to build endurance because it's a longer race, a faster race, a hotter race, even again maybe even a more emotional race? Like hey, we're gonna have to tweak the plan a little bit around this week.
Yeah, exactly that. When you are going to tracks that are, say, street circuits, highly technical, the mental demand is no doubt higher. The amount of gear changes, corners that they're doing, the amount of decisions and options that they have to change on their wheel with the dials and the shifts and the communication back and forth with the engineer, it is intense. There's no question about it. You're racing at Monaco, a race like that with the amount of technical maneuvers that you have to make compared to another race that might be something more of, let's say, Bahrain, which is a much bigger track by size. It's less intensive from the amount of corners that you will make and turns that you have to make and the switches and stuff. It's very different, but they both impose some very, very different challenges. Not least because of, when you're at a street circuit, you don't have a runoff. If you touch or make contact with the wall, you're in the wall, and that's it. You race over. Whereas if you make an error and you say exceed a track limit somewhere, and you're in Bahrain or you're in Barcelona, you've got a runoff. You've got, to an extent, a bit of grace where you can hopefully gain some margin back, turn the car around, and off you go again. So therefore, they propose some very, very different challenges. At the high speed circuits, for example, if you've got big braking zones, they have to be really strong on the brakes. And naturally, because of the increase in G's, the neck is going to take that load. For example, Silverstone, there's a sequence, one of my peers often refers to it, Maggots and Beckett's, and through that sequence there, the neck is going to take a load of 140 kilos because of you're going through a sequence of corners of 3 to 5 G's. And you're doing that over across a whole race weekend of 3 1 hour practice sessions, qualifying session, and a 2 hour race. There's a huge amount of load there that your neck has to be well conditioned for, and not least, you have to have a really good engine to deal with and then recover from each one of those events. So, the demands there are very different. So, from a training point of view, we will at certain periods certainly augment what we're doing from a neck point of view. We might work a little bit harder on maximal strength or overcoming eccentric strength of the neck, for example, so it's well equipped to deal with the rigors of what they're going to do. And then in other instances where we recognize the mental load goes up, should we say, because of, like I mentioned before, decision-making switches, cornering, braking, accelerating, we will try to manipulate what we're doing in training to give a little bit more mental load, such as doing a physical task while having to solve a technical equation or mentally react or physically react to something on a screen. So up-regulating that from a pressure point of view is really, really important. Is it exactly the event itself? No. But unlike football or rugby, we don't get to go on the pitch every day and practice that in the machinery. So there's very few opportunities, few and far between. The sim has a surrogate sort of step in between. There's an element of reality to that, but it's never quite the same thing either because you haven't got the feeling of the tires and the loading on the car and the grip either. So you you're guessing some of that's going to come from it as well. But yeah, there's certainly things that we try to do.
Yeah, I'm really hearing from you like this constant theme of adaptability, really understanding, being inquisitive of the athlete, understanding what they're needing, being able to react, which then just makes me like laugh even more when you think about the traveling circus that you're on. I mean, I know from other sports they look in at F1 at like all the money in there, but it's not like you're traveling with like the Rock's Iron Paradise $1 million gym goes everywhere with you on the back of a truck, right? What is it that comes with you everywhere you go that is almost like your non-negotiable as a coach?
What's the non-negotiable? Well, we have an amount of kit that we can travel with, and in between you've got your race suits, they've got their travel, their everyday wear suits, but a lot of those things in terms of media and the brand and the endorsements that they have, they're expected to wear different outfits and uniforms. So they're there, and I have to make sure that they're available and it's the right kit, right time for the right event, and so forth. And then we've got our equipment bag, and that's a combination of what we're doing from a nutrition supplement point of view. We've got our Hytro BFR in there. We've got a TRX in there if we can throw it up somewhere that's appropriate. You've got some warm-up bands and rollers and other bits and bobs and balls and some reaction stimuli. So we've got a kind of a traveling kit of bits and bobs really that we collect and assign, and maybe the odd ice bath comes out of that as well with a rubber duck, But we don't have, as you say, the luxury of lots of different training equipment, nor the space and the weight available to do that. We are quite fortunate, especially on the F1 circuit. I've done a number of years in other academy sports before I got here, and then junior categories here, and you're not staying in oftentimes some of the nicest hotels with the best equipment, and you're trying to make the most out of a pull-up bar and one leg press machine. Typically here, we do generally have access to some pretty good machines. However, the heavy lifting, if you like, is done away from all of that really. And if you're looking to chase physical athletic development in a race week, it's the wrong time to do it. So we're just sort of touching and priming and tweaking and recovering where we need to for race week, and then the rest of the time it's the time in the car and on the track doing what they do. They've got so many obligations. So, but yeah, we've got some bits and bobs.
Yeah, well, we've also been fortunate enough to see that Hytro comes on a little bit when you're doing your own training and traveling.
Busted, yeah.
Might be one of those coaches as well that's like, I need to be able to do it before I tell my athlete to do it. But yeah, the gun show's been there on social media. If anyone doesn't already follow John, definitely follow it for some gratuitous bicep content.
You put me out there with a reason. I was going to say it's totally not because there's a ton of photographers around or anything and look good in my shirt. It's obviously because I'm looking to present the right stance and use of I do it so you can do it, and yeah. No, again, it's just super time efficient, and I can get far more done in 10 or 15 minutes than I normally would like to do at home for say an hour. So yeah, it's a decent option.
But one of the things that we also love working with you is, like you've said, you obviously worked through a lot of academy programs, and you bring through those young athletes with great habits. We also know that you are actively involved in developing coaches as well, that next generation of S&C coaches. What advice would you give this next generation coming through around trying new things, and maybe starting with that mindset you have of being inquisitive, being adaptable, rather than that panic of, I've got to know everything before I can get started?
Well, maybe I'll answer this from the stance of, I think, what good young coaches do, and what I see as good examples this day and age currently. God, a statement like that sounds like I'm in my 40s. I'm not, I promise. But I think really, really smart, intelligent coaches who stand out to be a bit different and have something, they are undoubtedly inquisitive and curious. Like you've regardless if you've been in the game less than 10 years or 20 years, whatever it might be, you have to be fundamentally curious about solving problems, performance problems. So that's first. Naturally, you'd like to see some individuals practice what they're looking to deliver to, say, individuals. You don't need to be an outstanding athlete, but you need to demonstrate that you're also experimenting, understanding, and gaining a relatedness with your training practices that you're looking to deliver. So when you come to the table and you're having conversations about solving problems or figuring out how to solve improvements in someone's athleticism, you have some answers, which maybe at first hand that you've experienced yourself. Something that I think is often well discussed is networking and how to network effectively. I think that's synonymous with any environment, actually. I think that because it's an incredibly saturated space, there's a lot of coaches now trying to just get a leg up in some of the most, shall we say, way back, academy football was always competitive, but it's incredibly competitive now. And that tends to be one of the first places that people are looking to get into before they can step into a senior or a lead role. And you need to be really consciously aware about how you are approaching people for advice, support, direction, an opportunity to come and work and offer your hand for an hour. You've got to be really diligent about how you approach those conversations, and respectful about how you approach those conversations, because everyone's busy and people will give you the time if you approach it in the right way. And more often than not, that isn't often something that's seen, I think, when people are flirting in, cold emails and questions and messages. So, be diligent about that, because it is a very small world and people will be very surprised about how quicker their name spreads and the quality of character that people will carry on their behalf. So that's really important.
Yeah.
I'd say they're the two main areas.
The sports world is not 6 degrees of separation until it's usually 2. And everyone knows everybody, but also that's great because the things you do well do get seen. Having conversations with collegiate coaches in the States around team sports environments, there's not a ton of peer-to-peer sharing. And I was surprised to see that in many cases, you have a coach that thinks they have the winning formula, a modality, a tool, rep range, and they're like, that's it, it's mine, I'm not going to share it. How are young coaches going to get better unless there's more of that sharing of information going on?
Yeah, I think you've answered it in that statement right there. There's one thing to talk about network from a job opportunity point of view and in developing your career point of view. But ultimately, I think that what you're really fundamentally trying to do is develop a really successful but sustainable career. And to do that, at the very core of what you do, you have to have really effective relationships. And naturally, part of those relationships mean that you're going to share, you're going to be given sometimes some feedback from people about things that you could be doing differently or doing better. And you have to be willing to show up and be a little bit vulnerable about some of those conversations. Football often can get a bit of a bad rap for such an environment, to the point that you made. And I can talk about it because I've been in that environment where it can be a little bit siloed in the way that they operate at times, and maybe a bit self-preservation as well, because again of how competitive and sometimes how unstable and volatile certain positions are there. So people want to protect what they're doing and have a bit of secrecy around their IP. Obviously, nothing's new in performance science these days, or very little is new these days. It's the same method or the same philosophies that have been regurgitated, and they kind of go through different phases of popularity. So none of us are really doing anything that groundbreaking. But I think the folks that, again, sustainably have had successful careers, sustainably have constantly been in conversation with other people that have had success and advanced in certain fields, and look to recognize what they could do to join the party and or improve, and everyone grows together. And I think it's those individuals that tend to share, challenge, and support others, and be willing to receive feedback sometimes as how difficult it might be, are the folks who tend to learn more and progress more throughout their career. And so it's sharing it is I think pivotal to your own success, not least the domain that you're working in.
On that topic of that young coach development and sharing as well, how important is it for, or was it for you, and it might be for up and coming coaches, when you're going to try something new, BFR, blue light vision goggles, infrared technology, ice baths obviously been around for a long time, but is exploding even bigger at the moment. How important is it for you that there is this back catalogue of research to look on first, or do you subscribe to more like a, try it out. If the athlete feels good, that's good enough for me. As long as they turn up intentionally, that's fine.
You can't go far wrong with starting from a stance that says you're informed in terms of your practice, your data informed, your science informed. Like, that's a really solid place to start from. However, often, white paper articles don't necessarily hit the scene until 2 to 4 years after the studies have taken place. So if you're constantly waiting for that point, you're always going to be behind the 8 ball, so to speak, as well. And in a very fast growing, aggressive environment such as performance science, you have got curious athletes these days asking you constantly about, what about this? What about that new thing? What about that new supplement? What about this new training idea? And if you haven't got answers or at least an insight into those things, you do feel that you're a little bit less equipped to handle the needs of your people these days. So I think there's a balance between the art and the science. If we're talking about, I think BFR is probably a reasonable topic here, because from a health point of view, people want to make sure that what you're doing from a partially occluded limb point of view, when you're looking at restricting blood flow, that is that safe? Is it got good efficacy? So, if we're talking about those sorts of things, you want to make sure that there's a reasonable amount of safety and efficacy that's gone behind a method. Absolutely fine. But then in terms of, I think, how you iterate and adapt the way that a tool's being used or an intervention's been applied, you've got to be willing, I think, to, within the boundaries, explore And I think when you do it, and we look at how much research or noise is coming out lately about the use of BFR with cold water immersion. Cold water immersion and BFR have been around for decades, well accepted that they're beneficial, but no one's ever really considered doing the two of those together. So you've got to be a little bit innovative, and that just probably keeps the amount of interest in certain methodologies developing over time, not least use and the application of certain methodologies. So yeah, I think it's a bit of both.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I've got two questions to ask you. One I think is really revealing. I love to ask it, and that is in your opinion, as succinctly as possible, what makes a difference between a good and a great coach?
A good coach will tell you what they think they know. A great coach will listen to what's been said, and then they will tell you what they think they know. And that's just from a point of being socially, mentally astute enough to recognize what's needed and to respond, I think, appropriately around that.
Yeah. What would be the difference maker between a good and great athlete? If the coach was the ability to be able to observe, assess, and then suggest, rather than just go straight in with the answer, from an athlete point of view, what's the difference between good and great?
Good athletes are incredibly competitive and have a talent or an attribute in one or more areas that enable them to have good success, good performances. A great athlete undoubtedly might have a similar amount of attributes, but they do recognize usually failure is central to becoming a great athlete longer term. And when I say failure, learning from failure and being emotionally intelligent enough to learn from that, act on it, and then turn that into a success later down the line.
Yeah, because if you're never confronted with failure, you've never pushed yourself to your limit, so you're never going to be as good as you would have been anyway. So, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then last one for me would be, have you been in a car, F2 or F1, and experienced what it's like as an athlete?
Never been, nor should I be trusted to get in and drive one of those things. I've sat in a seat, and it's pretty humbling. I mean, I'm what touch under 85 kilos, and I'm not the tallest guy in the world. It has to be honest, has to be said. But there's not a huge amount of space in that cockpit. I'll be honest with you. You know, those seats are so shaped, and you're literally sat what feels like the tarmac, looking literally at the horizon of the road. So how they do what they do is just beyond me sometimes, with the conditions that they're in. But yeah, it's amazing what those boys can do at 300 kilometers an hour. It's madness. I've driven a car, and that's probably my limit, mate. I'll be honest.
So, I mean, you've been able to, and with previous athletes, almost like get in their mindset because you've played the sport. We've literally been in a position that the athlete needs to be in to take the weight, take the action, make the decision. How, as a coach, do you like? I know what you're going through when you're at 250 kilometers an hour. If you could just do this, how do you put like the 1-on-1 make two there?
That is difficult. That is difficult. But you know, I think athletes that are open-minded don't necessarily need to know that you've won an F1 race to provide some sort of value. It's the same in snow sport. When I first went there, what do you mean you can't snowboard? And you're gonna talk to me about how to perform better at my sport? You're in trouble, obviously. I think, or you've probably not been dealt a great hand if you're working with a few individuals that are very narrow-minded or closed-minded about the value that you can offer. And that's probably comes back to the point of collecting lots of data first, listening first, asking loads of questions, being really, really curious. And the amount of times, honestly, that I've been given a hand with coaches, physios, other practitioners that have been there, done it first, and kind of accelerated my understanding about the sport before I can go in and make the same mistakes, hugely, hugely helps and saves face again and again. Honestly, I can't stress that enough. So And I also think there is a huge amount of value to, as a practitioner, being vulnerable with your athlete and going, by the way, I don't know the answer to this, mate, but my hunch is this and this and this. Am I on the right line? What do you think about that? Would you suggest something different? And be willing to be corrected, and be willing to not be the brightest person in the room all the time. And I just ask tons of questions, which must be infuriating to some people, but that is ultimately, I think, how you close the gap between having experienced it to knowing, what the right steps or decisions are to get an improvement in something. But yeah, I think I'm that chameleon between the space of performing it and practicing it, and then I rely on others to fill the gaps in for me.
Yeah, it's a good strategy.
Yeah.
John, it's been wonderful speaking to you. Thanks again. It's always a pleasure. Thanks for the time. I know you're very, very busy. Best of luck for Japan to you and Yuki. I hope you do really, really well.
Thank you, mate. Appreciate it. Great to chat. And yeah, thanks for the questions. Enjoyed it.
Hope you enjoyed that episode with John Noonan. We've got plenty more to come from the coaches and athletes in the network. Don't miss out. Make sure you hit the subscribe button.